My topic tonight is Protestant mission history, 500 years, and the catastrophic mission ice age, which descended upon the Protestant world at the very beginning of the Protestant era, 1517. But I've got to back it up and talk a little bit about the context of two structures of God's redemptive mission. The crucial article which Dr. Ralph Winter presented in 1974. And he left to me the research for one aspect of the two structures theory. In the paper he wrote, if you only have the New Testament available to you, you might miss the Jewish basis of mission agencies. And that's what I did my research on for him. I was Dr. Ralph Winter's last PhD student, and my dissertation is up here. I'll give it away to 4 people that really want it. A new social contract relating mission agencies to ecclesiastical structures. Yes, it's that boring, but I hope that I can make a little sense out of one part of that topic today. What Dr. Winter was referring to was the two Jewish structures of the synagogue, which is very familiar to us because it is mentioned 56 times in the New Testament, and the Jewish missionary bands, which are more oblique and are called the Hevrah, H-E-V-R-A-H. But if you let your Jewish friends, especially scholars of the first century, read the Gospels and help you to see, you will see what is there hidden in plain sight, which is the presence of Jewish mobile missionary bands, people who have gathered and committed together to bring about something that they think is God's will and would improve the world and our relationship with God. So John the Baptist and his disciples was a Jewish Hevrah. They made a second commitment beyond the attending church at the synagogue. Jesus Christ and 12 men wandering through Capernaum and up into Galilee would be a Hevrah. Most prominent in the New Testament is the Pharisees. They were a Hevrah, mobile, going to the different synagogues and pleading with people to live the Levitical life. And of course, Paul was a Pharisee. So when he was knocked off the donkey and blinded for 3 days and fasting for 3 days, heard the word from Ananias of his new mission, he didn't have to make this up. He got a band of men, and they itinerated to the synagogues, and they brought the message of the person of Jesus Christ. God, do what you said would happen in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 26. The Lord will lift up a banner to the peoples. He will whistle to the nations, and they will surely come quickly. God, do what you said would happen in Isaiah 11, 1 and 2. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. God, do what you said would happen in Isaiah chapter 25, 6 through 8. On this mountain the Lord of hosts will prepare a feast for all the peoples, a feast of meat and wine. On this mountain the Lord will remove the shroud of death that covers the nations and wipe away every tear, and death shall be no more. Paul quotes that in 1 Corinthians 15:51. And yet when the Protestant era began, a catastrophic mission ice age occurred. So the background is two structures in first century Israel, which I have tried to represent here in a DNA molecule. Every healthy DNA has 2 helices, a double helix. And to help you see it, I've tried to express it in terms of these two structures. One which was for everybody, Jewish synagogue, and one which was for committed, mobile, mission-minded communities called the Hevrah. There were 2 structures in Paul's life. There was the Antioch administration of the church, and there was Paul and Barnabas' independent missionary team band, field governed. The Catholics retained this reality of the Bible, two structures of God's redemptive mission. One, the familiar Catholic churches with its hierarchy, and the second, the Catholic missionary bands, the orders which we're familiar with. That's the background to this understanding of two words which I want to bring out and help you at least cogitate on: modality and sodality. Modality is the entirety of a Christian community. It could be a synagogue in the Jewish experience, a church in the Catholic experience, or the local churches, or even the denominations in the Protestant experience. That's what we're most familiar with. It's what we talk about when we say we're going to church or we're getting a pastor. But there is a second structure, the sodality, which is the Jewish Hevra, the Catholic orders, or the mission agencies. Now, you can divide the Reformation history of 500 years into two parts. What caused a mission ice age to last 275 years, and how did it come to an end? Gerald Anderson has compiled a great number of missionary biographies and published them in his superb collection, The Biographical Dictionary of Christian Missions. I read every one of the 1,400 biographies, then created a database in order to understand what happened in the 500 years of Protestant mission history. We are going to look at the historical data and draw conclusions from the facts. Michael Faraday said, "Conclusions are drawn from data and its principles supported by evidence from facts." Here are the two conclusions I draw from the data. One, a catastrophic mission ice age descended upon the Reformation at its very beginning, and it lasted 275 years. Two, the ice age endured until William Carey published his inquiry in 1792, when a burst of mission activity began, setting in motion the Protestant Reformation era. Catholic missionaries regularly sailed during the entire Reformation. They didn't have an ice age. What made the difference between the Catholic and the Protestant version? Here is the first century of the Protestant mission era. Brace yourself. We're going to have to bust a myth. Kenneth Mulholland tells about the myth like this. Soon after Luther tacked the 95 Theses onto the church door at Wittenberg, there came a tremendous explosion of missionary expansion in the wake of the Reformation, as missionaries almost immediately began to go to the ends of the earth. Correct? Wrong. Virtually no Protestant mission activity took place between 1517 and 1792, yet those years constituted the golden age of Roman Catholic missions. Rodney Stark said, "Historians who don't count shouldn't." I counted the number of missionaries in the century of Luther and Calvin as collected by Gerald Anderson in his biographical dictionary. Then I created a timeline here to display the notable missionaries sent in the century of Luther and Calvin. The yellow is the Catholic missionaries. The black are the Protestant missionaries. Three notable Protestant missionaries. Two of them were Anabaptists, so they weren't Reformed. They weren't Calvinist or Lutheran. They were Peter Riedemann and Hans Schmidt. Sadly, the Reformers and the Catholics persecuted these two men for rebaptizing adults. Schmidt was executed, and Riedemann was imprisoned for 9 years. Let's do the math. 3 missionaries minus the 2 Anabaptist missionaries leaves 1 notable Reformed missionary in the century of Luther and Calvin. 1 missionary compared to 52 Catholic missionaries. How do you feel about that? The one Reformed missionary mentioned in Anderson's book is Jean de Larrey. Jean de Larrey was 21 years old when he volunteered to sail from Geneva to an island near Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. There, a soldier of fortune named Nicolas de Villegnon and 600 French men of arms had built a fort. This was in 1557. John Calvin sent de Larrey and other Christians with him to be chaplains to the soldiers on the island, but a rift over the meaning of the Eucharist opened between Nicolas de Villegnon and his newly arrived chaplains. 8 months later, de Villegnon expelled de Larrey and the other chaplains from the colony. Exhausted and starving, de Larrey and the other chaplains boarded a pirate ship and returned to Europe. This is the story of the one notable Reformed missionary in the century of Luther and Calvin. In our day, some Reformed colleagues promote this man as an example of John Calvary's commitment to mission. This puzzles me considerably. Why did the Protestant mission effort languish? Some suggest that the Protestant Reformation was just getting started, that Luther and Calvin needed more time to organize for overseas missions. However, that would mean that the number of Protestant missionaries should begin to rise by the end of that century. That did not happen. Reformation churches sent out no notable missionaries in the last 40 years of the 16th century. The timeline of the Reformation missionaries is flat like an EEG of a dead man. Stephen Neal, historian and bishop from India, wrote, when everything favorable has been said, and when all possible evidence from the writings of the reformers have been collected, missions amounts to exceedingly little. David Bosch wrote, it would take centuries before anything remotely as competent and effective as the monastic missionary movement would develop in Protestantism. Calvin had a great effort in France among his own French-speaking people, and many defenders promote Calvin as a mission-minded man in this way. Some of my readers will remind me that John Calvin actually sent many missionaries to France, his home country. This is a wonderful story. I am not sure it is a missionary story because Anderson does not mention any of these missionaries in his biographical dictionary. Robert Kingdom writes, Calvin had an intense passion for the conversion of France to the Reformed faith. In 1553, Calvin began sending missionaries to France. Most of these missionaries had come to Geneva as refugees from France while fleeing persecution. Yet after being trained by Calvin in theology, moral character, and preaching, he sent them back to plant churches in France. This effort by Calvin had tremendous success. By 1555, there were 5 Reformed churches in France. In 1559, there were almost 100. By 1562, the number had reached 2,100. In other words, Calvin was passionate and an evangelist to his own people, the French. Dr. Ralph D. Witter invented an evangelism scale, or E-scale, pictured here, to help us understand the different kinds of outreach. E1 evangelism is the noble effort of bringing Christians of one's own culture to faith in Jesus Christ. John Calvin's passion to evangelize the French population was E1. John Knox of Scotland is another example of E1 evangelism. John Knox thrilled his listeners when he said, "Give me Scotland or I die." Jean Delaire's trip to Brazil was E1 evangelism. However, a special missionary effort is needed to evangelize people of different cultures and very different cultures. Reformation churches failed at E2 and E3 missions. Churches today need to partner with mission agencies in order to establish churches in the regions beyond. Reformed churches did not send missionaries to different cultures or very different cultures. Some of my readers are writing to express their opinion that doctrinal disputes had to be settled before the Reformation leaders could send missionaries. There were indeed shameful disputations. For example, Swiss reformer Ulrich Zwingli was busy tracking down and drowning Anabaptists, such as Felix Manz, for getting rebaptized as adults. Zwingli was also occupied with his plan to starve the Catholics in the next Swiss canton into seeing the advantages of Protestant Christianity. Reformers sent no missionaries, yet hundreds of Catholic missionaries continued to deploy. This was because the Catholic Church established 2 administrative structures. One for the church where it already existed, and the second for sending and governing missionaries where there is no church. The sending structure was the means of deploying Catholic missionaries such as Johann Begert, a Jesuit missionary to the Guaycura Indians of Lower California. It was Johann Begert who wrote to the Protestants, shaming them for sitting behind their stoves in Wittenberg and Geneva while millions perished for lack of scriptural knowledge. The Reformed churches denied themselves these mission agencies and even suppressed attempts by their own members to establish mission structures. The wind of the Spirit was moving upon the waters, but the Reformers did not hoist their sails. The sails of the mission agencies, and these Catholics unfurled their sails to their advantage. Next century, 2nd century of the Reformation. As I mentioned, I read all 1,400 mission biographies in Gerald Anderson's Biographical Dictionary of Christian Missions, then copied the names of every missionary and the date he or she arrived on the mission field. In the 2nd century of the Reformation, Anderson features 12 notable Protestant missionaries, or about 1 every 8 years. Of these 12, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, a mission agency, sent 2. Of these, one was John Eliot, missionary to the New England Indians. The other was named Experience Mayhew, missionary to the Indians in what is today Martha's Vineyard. William Carey will express his admiration for the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel as an inspiration. Roger Williams, founder of Providence, Rhode Island, is also among the 12 in Anderson's dictionary. Roger Williams, it should be noted, escaped arrest from the Reformed Church in Massachusetts, where the Reformed churches had heard that he was baptizing adults. Thankfully, the Indians protected Roger Williams and restored him to health. In any case, there were 12 notable Protestant missionaries in the 2nd century of the Reformation. This compares to 70 notable Catholic missionaries, more than 5 times as many. What was the Catholic advantage? The Catholic advantage was its missionary agencies, administered by Franciscans, Benedictines, Augustinians, Ursulines, Sisters of Poor Clare, Dominicans, Jesuits. Rufus Anderson wrote, "The monasteries were papal forms of missionary societies, and it was by means of these associations that the gospel was originally propagated among our ancestors and all over Europe. Had Lutherans and Calvinists encouraged missionaries to organize a version of the Catholic orders, the great era of Protestant missions could have begun in 1600 instead of 1800. Why did the Protestant mission effort languish? Were Protestants too poor? Some have suggested that Protestants did not have the money to send missionaries, but this is not so. Protestant wealth increased a great deal in the 2nd century, featured in the timeline here. In fact, Amsterdam became the 3rd largest city in Europe after Paris and London, and one of the world's wealthiest cities. From Reformed Church city of Amsterdam harbor, 30 merchant ships sailed every month to the Dutch East and the Dutch West Indies, as well as to Brazil and the New Amsterdam in America. The Dutch traded for tulips and spice and slaves, but did not spread the gospel of the kingdom of God to the regions beyond. What was the Protestant disadvantage? Did they have religious wars to fight? It is a shame that Christians slaughtered one another over their differences in belief. That generation served false gods. At least we can be glad that the Peace of Westphalia ended the religious wars in Europe in 1648. Did the Protestants turn their attention finally to sending missionaries? It would seem they did not. The Reformed leaders invested considerable energy in deterring Justinian Wells, for example, from organizing a mission society called the Jesus Loving Society. We will meet Justinian Wells on my blog site. The Wittenberg Statement on Missions. In 1651, 3 years after the Peace of Westphalia, the highly influential and respected Lutheran faculty of the University of Wittenberg issued a statement denying the validity of the Great Commission. The Wittenberg Statement was widely accepted in the Lutheran Church and in many Reformed churches. Sadly, the Wittenberg Statement effectively suppressed all mission initiatives for the next 150 years. The Wittenberg Statement contained these 3 points. 1, only the apostles in the 1st century were privileged to fulfill the Great Commission. Therefore, missions are not the responsibility of the church. 2, no non-Christians are excused before God because of the ignorance of the gospel. Those who do not believe are presumed to have rejected the gospel when it was preached to them by the apostles during the 1st century. Therefore, European Christians today have no need to assume responsibility for the lostness of non-Christians. 3, rulers are responsible to propagate the gospel in their own territories alone. The Wittenberg Fathers were satisfied that the rulers had faithfully carried out this duty. What does my audience think about the Wittenberg Statement? I think it is not biblical and should be rejected. Luther, where are you when we need you? Luther would have taken his stand on Scripture and plain reason. The Wittenberg Statement is a man-made system imposed upon the Bible by misguided church administrators. It is an embarrassment. It is a false doctrine. It is a Frankenstein monster. Another century has passed, and still the Reformation churches send only one notable missionary every 8 years. What is the cause of the mission ice age? It is not a lack of money. It is not the wars that suppress the sending of missionaries. The mission ice age will come to an end when William Carey repairs the breach between Protestant churches and mission agencies. With every passing century, the Reformation churches prove that mission languages for lack of mission agencies. The wind of the Spirit was moving over the waters, ready to send missionaries. The sails of the mission agencies, and the sails are the mission agencies, and these the Catholics unfurled to their advantage. But the Reformers would not hoist their sails. Sadly, the Reformed churches actually suppressed attempts by their own members to establish independent mission agencies. Had the Protestants founded a way to allow missionaries to organize a Protestant version of the Franciscans and Jesuits, the great era of Protestant missions could have begun in the 16th, 17th, or 18th century rather than delay until the end of the 19th. The next century. Between 1701 and 1800, Reformed churches sent only 5 notable missionaries, about one every 20 years. Mission societies, however, sent 59 notable missionaries, 12 times as many. By counting the number of notable missionaries for 300 years, as we have done, we can make a prediction. If there were no mission agencies, the Protestant church would send about 5 missionaries every century. With the establishment of mission agencies, a more hopeful future will become apparent. In this timeline, I have color-coded. Let's see if it comes up. This is my most complicated one. So, in this timeline, I have color-coded the names of the mission agencies. The most important mission agencies in this century are the Danish Hala Mission to India, the Moravians, Church Missionary Society, the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. Those 3 are all established by the British Crown. And at the end of the century, Baptist Missionary Society by William Carey and the London Missionary Society, etc. Those were founded after William Carey, of course. Now I want to draw your attention to an 80-year timeline, an amazing 80 years, with William Carey's event in the dead center of this 80-year timeline. 40 years before 1792 and 40 years following 1792. There are 17 notable Protestant missionaries in the 40-year period prior to William Carey in 1792, about one every 2 years. Carey mentions these missionaries, the Moravians, John Wesley, David Brainerd, John Eliot, all of whom were sent by mission agencies. 3 missionaries in the 40 years prior, 3 of the 17 were sent without a mission agency. They were Jacobus Kapitein, an African freed slave who returned to Ghana as a chaplain to the Dutch merchant colony. Samuel Occam, a Mohegan Native American who undertook his own mission to the Native Americans of Connecticut. And David George, born a slave on a plantation of Virginia. He escaped to Canada and from there sailed to Sierra Leone as a missionary. These are the 3 that surface in Gerald Anderson's book. 17 missionaries compared to 147 missionaries sent in the 40 years after 1792. Yes? You want to see? You want to see? All right, I get it. Thank you. All 147 were sent by mission agencies, except Robert McDowell, who was a Canadian church planter among the English-speaking settlers of Canada. A modest prediction. How effectively were missionaries sent without mission agencies? In our timeline, a missionary sent without a mission agency was sent about every 20 years. But in the second half of the timeline, 147 missionaries, about one every 4 months in Gerald Anderson's collection. A modest prediction can be suggested. Had Reformation churches continued to suppress the establishment of mission agencies, the Ice Age would have continued. But the Ice Age began to end with the rise of what Andrew Walls calls the fortunate subversion of the church. Here's Andrew Walls. The Catholic mission movement had been able to develop on the basis of the religious orders, but the Reformation had slain the goose that laid the golden egg. Fortunately, Andrew Walls says, Carey finally came along to invent the organizational and logistical technology that most potent instrument of Protestant missionary movement, the voluntary society. Looking at the timeline, we are able to answer a question that comes up in my conversations. Prior to William Carey's book, there was the number of missionaries. Was it increasing? This is what people say. William Carey was just one light of many who were coming along at a time of the whoosh, the increase of mission agencies. I propose to you, well, you can see for yourself. That's what David Bosch says, by the way. Carey was only one voice in this period, and the spirit of mission and renewal were simply in the air. To that I say, in the air, yes, I concede the point. For a long time the wind had been blowing in the air. The Catholic missionaries went out to sea, blown out there by the wind of the Spirit. Not so the Reformation Church. Calvinists and Lutherans such as Justinian Wells had been feeling called as missionaries, apostolic people, since the beginning of the Reformation, but feeling the call is not the same as going. And in the air is not the same as hoisting the missionary sails. For 300 years, the Reformation churches had arrogated to themselves the sole authority to send missionaries. The result, one missionary every 20 years. That was about to change. The Protestant missionary sails were hoisting, and hundreds of missionaries were going to sail to Asia, Africa, and the New World when Carey supposed a company of serious Christians to form themselves into a mission society. The most important page in Carey's inquiry is this. Suppose a company of serious Christians, ministers and private persons were to form themselves into a society and make a number of rules respecting the regulation of the plan and the persons who are to be employed as missionaries and the means of defraying the expenses. This society must consist of persons whose heart is in the work, men, he says, of serious religion and possessing a spirit of perseverance. There must be a determination not to admit any person who is not of this description or to retain him longer than he answers to it. And then he adds, the most glorious works of grace that have ever taken place have been in answer to prayer, and it is in this way we have expected the greatest reasons to suppose that the glorious outpouring of the Spirit, which we expect at last, might be bestowed. Many can do nothing but pray, and prayer is perhaps the only thing in which Christians of all denominations can cordially and unreservedly unite. But in this we may all be one. But we must not be content, however, simply with praying, without exerting ourselves in the use of means for the obtaining of those things we pray for. Were the children of light but as wise as in this generation as the children of this world, they would stretch every nerve to gain so glorious a prize. Nor they would not imagine that it was to be obtained by any other way. William Carey had devised a reproducible operating system, the missionary society. The effect on English and American Christians was immediate. A great century of Protestant culture Protestant missions had begun. William Carey changed the world before he sailed to India. The Protestant missionary movement that arose, Andrew Walls wrote, became possible only by these means of these new structures. In Europe and America alike, effective overseas missions began not with the official machinery of the churches, but with voluntary societies. Lyle Vander Werth called it the great breakthrough, and Ralph Winter called Carey's inquiry probably the most single influential document in the history of Protestant missions and the Magna Carta of the Protestant mission movement. Now my most important slide. Another picture of the same 80-year period with William Carey's inquiry and founding of the Baptist Missionary Society in 1792, 40 years before and 40 years after. In the very center of the timeline, the first mission society in modern Protestant era appeared. That was William Carey's Baptist Missionary Society. Before William Carey, nothing. After William Carey, everything. It is hard to imagine a more clear before and after in Protestant missions history than to understand the sudden beginning, the sudden setting in motion of the Protestant mission societies era. There had been monarch-chartered mission societies established 100 years earlier, such as the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge and the Danish Holland Mission. We featured them. Carey referred to these as former undertakings and admired them. But Carey's major novelty, as Ralph D. Winter aptly called it, is writing a do-it-yourself instruction manual for others to copy. This was not rocket surgery. Wait, that's a mistake there. His simple design could be assembled by ordinary English citizens thanks to a law that the Parliament had passed called the Enabling Act of 1779. Don't forget that a government has to act before private citizens can organize nonprofit organizations. You can read Carey's 92-page inquiry and his phrase, the use of means, which is in the title but shows up here again and refers to the establishing of mission societies. We must not be contented with praying without exerting ourselves in the use of means for obtaining those things for which we pray. Carey's easy-to-assemble instruction booklet set in motion the establishment of a great number of mission agencies. He lit the first firecracker on a string of 100, and it went off like Chinese New Year's. Christians began organizing new mission societies and sending missionaries as never before, as we have seen. Now, I want to draw your attention to this 80-year period and show you the importance of the Enabling Act of 1779 in British Parliament. The importance cannot be overstated. A government must pass a law enabling its citizens to organize voluntary societies. In most countries, voluntary societies are illegal and will be shut down. England and the United States were the first countries in the world to pass laws enabling their citizens to organize voluntary societies. The Enabling Act of 1779 permitted English citizens to start addressing social problems by organizing and joining voluntary societies. Today, there are about 40 free world countries that permit their citizens to organize voluntary societies. These countries are mainly in Europe and North America, but also include other countries with a vast Christian influence, such as Costa Rica and South Korea. South Koreans are free to organize missionary societies, not so in North Korea. Sadly, none of the 40 Muslim countries in the world allow their citizens to organize voluntary societies. See Freedom's House Index of Countries of the World. William Carey was fortunate to organize his mission society after English Parliament passed the Enabling Act of 1779. So was Robert Raikes. Here is Robert Raikes' story. Robert Raikes organizes the first Sunday schools. Robert Raikes took advantage of the new law and organized a Sunday school in 1780 in his hometown of Gloucester, England. The Church of England disapproved, but to no avail. The law was on Raikes' side for the first time in history. Raikes held his first classes in the kitchen of a sympathetic woman named Mrs. Meredith. He is hailed today as the founder of the Sunday school system, and of course today you would imagine that Sunday schools are found in the Bible, but it all started with this man and the Enabling Act. Okay. Coming to a close. Why a mid-course correction was needed in 1792. The first part of a 270-year mission ice age began at the start of the Reformation in 1517 and lasted until 1792. The second part of this chart is 208 years, because that's when Anderson wrote the book. So there's about 60 extra years on the left-hand side. He published his biographical dictionary in 1998. 1,400 missionaries are written about. Of the 1,100 notable Protestant missionaries featured in his book, of 1,100, about 27 were sent by churches, so far as I can tell. We can make a prediction. Had the church, as we normally think of church, succeeded in suppressing the establishment of mission societies, a Protestant mission era would never begin. Paul Pearson could say with confidence, when a theology says that only the organized church should be involved in missions, that theology has a very serious quarrel with history. For this reason, there is theological repair to be undertaken, and repair is my mission. Meanwhile, another critic is knocking at my door, asking, Blincoe, why are you discrediting the church? I believe the conditions for repair can be created by an understanding of the biblical basis for mission agencies and studying the Protestant mission ice age to understand what really happened in history. Luther expected the entire world to hear the gospel. He said, before the last day comes, church rule and Christian faith must spread throughout the world. He wrote a missionary hymn, based on Psalm 67. It stirs the blood, makes the hair stand up on the back of your head. May God bestow upon us his grace, with blessings rich provide us, and may the brightness of his face to life eternal guide us, that we his saving health may know, his gracious will and pleasure, and also to the heathen show Christ's riches without measure, and unto God convert them. For Luther, mission meant reestablishing the church on its true evangelical foundation in Jesus Christ. The church, missionary in its very nature, is God's instrument in sending out his word to the world. Every baptized believer has a right and a duty to witness to Christ. Luther expected the world to hear the gospel, though Gustav Warneck has criticized the reformers because fundamental theological views hindered them from giving their activity or thoughts to missionary. Later scholars have demonstrated that Luther's theology and understanding of church and kingdom are essentially missionary in nature. In fact, David Bosch adds, he, Luther, provided the church's missionary enterprise with clear and important guidelines and principles. The starting point of the reformers' theology was not what people could or should do for the salvation of the world, but what God had already done for them. But they left the sails on the deck. And as I said from Stephen Neal, the reformers did exceedingly little. Worse, they catastrophically suppressed the mission agencies. Luther dissolved the Catholic monasteries, though he himself had received his doctorate as an Augustinian monk. So in conclusion, the 500-year history of Protestant missions is dividable before and after 1792. That is the year someone knocked on the door. That someone was William Carey. Let him speak the word that changed the world. That word is suppose. Thank you very much.